we evaluate a new administration? What should be the criteria? Do we look at specific issues? Do we look at the broken campaign promises? What tool of measurement do we use to say, okay, this is a successful administration? Another question is, what are the limitations of the U.S. presidency? Okay, how much can a president actually do? How much is also dependent on the other branches of government? A third point is, what role does the media play in defining a successful administration? Another thing that to go back and look at is the style, I call it style points. We know, for example, that there was always a lot of jokes made about the president's ears. And then there was a lot of discussion about the fact that the president is a good listener. Well, the question 1 year later will be, who is he listening to? And how big are his ears? That's the question that one could raise. And then also in terms of style, to what extent does Michelle Obama provide a certain beautiful gloss to the administration in terms of having an open market not far from the White House, or inviting poetry and country western singers into the White House and creating a sort of new Camelot type of feel. And then I think what we're looking at in terms of even today is how does an administration handle crisis management? Because we know, for example, that a crisis can really end or cripple an administration, whether it's the Bay of Pigs missile crisis, or Katrina, not you, but the other Katrina. It can really be a situation. I make a projection. Andy knows I'm always making projections. I was talking about an earthquake coming and knocking out the Tiger Woods scandals and things of that sort. And I think we're almost at a point where if you see images coming in which you see a certain sort of breakdown in terms of government in Haiti, and you have to send troops in, and those images begin to come out, someone will say, well, do we have to occupy Haiti like we did in the past with Marines? And what does that image look like coming across from an administration? Okay, especially if it's just headed by African Americans. Because I think another way of looking at this administration last year is in terms of race also, which sometimes we don't want to discuss. I feel as a black person, race is a good thing. I look in the mirror every morning and I feel good about it. Sometimes we don't want to talk about it. But what we're also looking at is what happens when a person of color now begins to change foreign policy or begin to take a presence on the world stage. You could go back, for example, to the Carter administration and the appointment of Andy Young. And there was a lot of complaints about why should Andy Young be ambassador to the UN? He has no foreign policy experience. My response was that Andy Young looks like an ambassador. He dresses good. Style points. But I just outlined those few things in terms of everything from the limitation of the presidency to how we should evaluate success. I know, for example, IPS gave the presidency a C. Was it C minus?
C minus.
C minus. Well, I could look at places like Harvard and others where everybody's getting A's and it's grade inflation. So many times a C minus is good because you learn. You take things for granted. But I think that this is a way in terms of one, that if you're a student and you get a grade, you want the teacher to explain. So I guess I turn to the teacher.
You're the teacher. I'm going to begin with Michelle Obama because I read in the paper this morning. There's a lot written about her campaign for sustainable food, for the fight against obesity, but I was struck today that she, again yesterday, made a tour to a federal agency. And with government so maligned and demeaned and depersonalized, there is something very smart about this systematic tour of meeting either with kids as she did or with the workers and thanking them for their contributions to this country. Because you can't, I'm going to sound like, you can't love your country and hate your government. Bill Clinton, one of the best things he said, it's true. How do you judge? Well, you mentioned something very important, Ethelbert, which is not only stem cell research, but the restoration of scientific integrity. That was a very, very critical moment. And I think that is lost sometimes because the pace of our life and media coverage, which relates partly to what you were saying, is not 24/7 anymore, it's 36/7. And I think that this administration has had, and this is, you've read this, but has had to deal in a media environment unknown, unprecedented. And also, I would argue on a number of fronts, the challenges are perhaps greater than during the Great Depression. In the economic sphere, it's worth remembering that Roosevelt didn't deal with a workforce in China, a global workforce coming in to the global workforce. And I think we lose sight sometimes in the pace of change. One measure for me, and I've talked to Chris Hayes about this, is the nation is 145 years old. I go back, and not to sound obsessed here, I did grow up in a family where we were not allowed to call it the Roosevelt Court Packing Plan. We had to call it the Roosevelt Reorganization of the Court Plan. But the nation was very critical of Roosevelt, and we all know that it was the pressure from below. It was the movements from below, the militants from below, which moved him to pass even imperfect bills like Social Security. So to me, how to measure this president, I am a little bit in the school with Robert Caro, who has a short contribution to our forum. It's too early to tell. It's too early to tell. There's some very signature steps taken. One being on the side of the banks with the way they bailed out the banks. But there is some movement now. There is some movement late in the game, and the possibility of a real and not just gestural jobs program is not one to be lost sight of. The limitations of the US president, enormous. I was going to talk earlier about going deep. You and I emailed about that, and you mentioned a football pass. I didn't think of going deep in that context. I was thinking of, systemic change. We at the nation, for better or worse, and I'm sure there are disagreements about this, have seeded this idea of let's rethink and abolish this filibuster. Tom Gagan, who was a very good labor lawyer who writes for us, ran for Congress unsuccessfully in Chicago, Chris Hayes, William Greider, others have laid out how this process at the heart of perhaps the least democratic legislative body in a democracy is metastasized into supermajority rule, compounding the anti-democratic nature of our system. And I also think the corrosion of money. These are real limits on a president. Finally, in terms of the national security apparatus, I do think we still don't know the full story of how Obama, though he was true in some ways to his campaign promise on Afghanistan, was cornered, boxed in by generals and become a captive. Though a president has leeway in foreign policy, so unlike in some other areas when it doesn't relate to treaties, but has become captive to a process, if not a mindset. The last thing I would say, though, is also on foreign policy. We lose sight of, and you and I have also emailed about this, that speech in Cairo, the rhetoric, the language, words mean something. The danger is when he did extend a hand of America to the Muslim world, to the moderate Muslim world. The other hand was bombing. The other hand causing enormous collateral damage among Muslims. And so how you square that, it's a sadness, because you certainly can measure a president by his language, but it's also deeds.